We're recording. Good morning, Sophie, or hello, Sophie. It's not morning anymore here with us. Um, thank you. Good. Hi, everybody. Sophie and I would like to talk about stability today. Stability within. We had some discussions leading now before we turned on the recording button about creating stability and how we create stability. And is it creating stability so we're just going to call it stability within. And stability within, I think we can both agree, is mainly created by our relationship to thought, by the way we relate to our thinking. We tend to believe our thoughts, or we tend to have the belief that our thoughts are true, and we tend to have a belief that we are our thoughts, that our mind is who we are. And this is the base of much suffering, this belief. And I think this is what we'd like to get to a little bit today, is disidentifying with the mind. Now, the mind is nothing more than the thought that you're having at this moment. It's always just one thought, and we call it the mind. And many of us tend to believe that we are this mind, and this mind leads us into suffering, conceptualizes the context. But I'm going to let Sophie perhaps deconstruct the mind very shortly. Sophie, perhaps you can do that the way we spoke. I don't want to demonize the mind totally, but perhaps you could deconstruct thought for us from a Buddhist perspective. And perhaps before you begin, I want to say creating stability does not mean stopping thought. It does not mean not thinking. And we tend to believe that in order to be happy, we have to turn off the mind. And this is not entirely true. There's two different kinds of thinking. There's functional thinking and dysfunctional thinking. So when we're distancing ourselves from thought, we are distancing ourselves in particular from dysfunctional thinking. And I'm going to leave that perhaps there and move over to Sophie, and perhaps you can help us by deconstructing or discussing thought in general from a Buddhist perspective. I hope I'm not jumping on you with that. We're not very prepared today.
No, we're not.
Due to coronavirus.
That's a good exercise. No, thank you, Lisa. I can only relate to what you've just said, is that thinking is really a wonderful and marvelous function of the mind. It's because we think that we can operate in our everyday life. With thinking, we can remember to do certain things. We can also plan to do other things. So it's useful. We need this thinking in order to move through our life.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, maybe the trigger is that comes from not that we think as human beings, but the way we relate to this thinking mind.
Mm-hmm.
And the tendency for us is to define ourselves through our thinking. Mm-hmm. Because I think this, I am this. Because I think that, I am that. Mm-hmm. And we rarely actually question the content of our thoughts. Mm-hmm. And a question that might be sometimes quite useful to ask is, Baron Katie is absolutely an expert on that. She just raised a simple question: is it true? Mm-hmm. And it's really true. I mean, a lot of our thinking, are they really helpful? Are they helping us, to be creative in life, to be open, to be loving, to be caring, to be compassionate, to be helpful? Or are they hinder something? Are they a source of hindrances? Are they an obstacle? What are they doing? Are they leading us to suffering? So we can really start to, here we are already entering in a very different relationship with our thoughts, because there is a part of us that is saying that there is a thinking mind, there is something that is thinking, and that we're not obliged to believe what it is said. And this is one of the aspects, because the topic is creating stability within. And this constant thinking is actually what will prevent us from having clarity of mind and from finding mental calm. And of course, from a Buddhist perspective, I can only speak about that, the tendency of the mind is really to elaborate upon any sense object that arises in experience. So what does this mean? Concretely, I will just give a very simple example. You're in the garden, you're outside, or you're in a park, or I don't know, you have a bits of nature in front of your eyes, and you see a flower. And what the mind is going to do very quickly, are you going to stay, and being really in this moment of experiencing maybe the joy of experiencing beauty, the beauty of this flower, just looking at the color, looking at the light, looking at the shape, the form. Are you experiencing this? Or are you already, poof, instead of just being in this moment of just seeing something, or are you already, elaborating a lot of things about it? And what I mean by that is that, okay, you like the flower. Okay, you have a garden. Wow. And then you start to think, and it goes so fast, you don't even see it happening. You see the flower. Oh, it's so beautiful. Oh, I want one in my garden. And if I want one in my garden, then what is this species of this flower? What seed should I buy? And what shop I should go to, to get this flower, And you see how quickly, suddenly, instead of just being in the experiential moment of the eyes that is seeing a flower, you're already in your thought. You're totally lost in thought. And as I said, there is no problem about wanting a flower, wanting it in your garden, and inquiring where you could buy it. It's no problem. But the problem comes from the fact that you don't realize that this is happening. And you're totally indulging the story of the thought, and you totally identify with the story of the thought. And when you do that, the problem is that there is no space for anything else. And then you only see that. And what you are defined by in that moment, in this example, is just your own greed. You want the flower. You see? There is a beautiful flower. And because it's beautiful, you like it. And because you like it, and straight away you think, I want it. And, blah, and you put all strategies. So this is very interesting. And this is really prevent us from just being, being grounded and being just admiring a beautiful flower and receiving, being in a receptive mode and maybe enjoying the joy that is there. Just a sense of beauty. You miss that because you're already, you're not in the present anymore. As soon as you're in your thought, it's like whether you're anticipating into the future or whether you are in the past. Okay, I could go on, but I play pause and I leave the space to you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very helpful. I think I'm going to kind of pick up on what you said about this elaboration. and we see something, we get some, I call it, we get input from our input channels, and those are our five senses, because that's the only way we can take contact with the world, is through one of the input channels, and generally with several all at once. And then that sort of comes in and is interpreted by the mind. And what you're talking about is, for me, is we get lost in this interpretation. We get lost in the story that we're telling ourselves about what is going on, about what we see or what we hear, or the events unfolding around us. And we interpret them immediately. That happens so quickly, like Sophie said. It just happens so quickly that we don't realize that this is happening. And then we begin to have emotions and reactions based not upon what the input channels have given us, not that information, but we're now responding upon reacting from the interpretation that we've had. And in many cases, that's okay. That we need to interpret. We need to understand. This is part of our functioning mind and our functional mind. But it's when it causes suffering within us or suffering for others that becomes dysfunctional. And oftentimes it's very difficult for us to see that the story that we tell ourselves, the interpretation that we have, drifts very far from the objective reality, if I can use that word here, that what we're actually taking in. And this can really be painful when we are particularly speaking of fear, because this is something that we spoke of before we started recording this morning, is fear. And we tend to project then our interpretation into the future and make all sorts of ugly predictions and frightening predictions. And they're basically based on the things that we remember out of the past, which was also only a interpretation of what was happening. So the entire mental activity that's going on can be very, very far from objective reality, and this can be very, very painful. Causes a plethora of uncomfortable emotions, and of course the emotions that are caused by the thinking create even more conceptual thinking. So one story creates the next story, creates the next story. And sometimes I like to say, if anybody could hear my thinking, they'd lock me up. They'd put me in that little white jacket and just send me off. And I think this is true for 99.9% of us. If we sit and listen to our thinking, we realize, we know how dysfunctional it could be. And I think in creating stability, or speaking of stability, it's not as much wanting to change that thought, but it's in changing the way we relate to that thought. And I'm going to switch over to Sophie again now, because I think this is now kind of the heart of what we wanted to talk about. So we're not talking about changing thought per se, but changing the way we relate to thought and changing the way we understand thought. And by changing the way we relate to thought and by changing the way we understand thought, which means breaking our identification with thought, thought itself changes. But the change only comes if that's not our intention. So, but I'm going to switch over to Sophie now, so perhaps she can talk a little bit about that, about the way we relate to thought.
As you said, most of the time we're not aware of that chain reaction that is taking place as soon as, I don't know, we're in contact with something, through seeing, through hearing, through smelling, through tasting. As we said, you said, I said, it goes so fast. So this is the aim of the topic today, is how to create stability within. Because for me, from my own experience, maybe Lisa, you will approach from another angle. But for me, in my own experience, the main thing, in order to learn to engage myself differently with my own thinking, with the thought that are arriving in my mind, I I needed to learn how to ground myself, how to quiet a bit myself,
And how
to
did you
feel
do that?
stable. Yeah.
How did you do that?
Yeah. Well, um, as I am trained as a Buddhist, there is a very classical way to do it, which is called, and all the mindfulness movement is based upon that. This is the Satipatthana Sutta, which is a text, an old text on the four foundations of mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the aspects is to create this stability within. We focus on the body, through breathing, as we said, through the posture for the Zen people, for example, through walking. For example, if you're running, you're doing some sport, you focus on the movement on the body. You can focus on the anatomy when you do a body scan. You can also contemplate, the decay of the body, which is another thing. There is another way. There is another way we mentioned also earlier. This is the second foundation: is to pay more attention to the as we said, we call them our like and our disliking. What we like, what we dislike. This kind of tonality, what we get in touch with something. So to learn to bring back our attention to that when it's happening also can have this effect of what we mean by creating stability. It's very basic. It's to learn to bring our attention back to the here and now. And that's what this foundation, the first one, is the body, because actually the body is always here and now. When you connect with your body, simultaneously you're here, because the body is sitting right here, right now. There is two other, foundations that are maybe a little bit. I don't want to go too much on that, but the third one is about paying attention to the mind, and especially your mind state, and especially also the thinking mind or the emotional mind. And here there is really this opportunity to learn to see thinking as object. You're sitting here, and suddenly there is the thinking of going to play tennis with your friend, and realizing, because you're seeing it, this is happening. You don't get caught up into the story. You stay here, and you recognize this is thinking. Mm-hmm. And when you are in this space, you don't get lost to the thought. So that's one of the third. That's the third foundation of mindfulness. And the fourth is very, very Buddhist, because it's all it's to make of all the Buddhist concepts. It englobes the Four Noble Truths. It englobes the 7 factors of awakening. It englobes the 5 hindrances and all the aggregates. But this is another topic. But for us here in this discussion, I think really paying attention to the body, paying attention to the tonality, and paying attention really to our mind state. The mind state are very important as well. Yeah. Recognize, because when you learn to see the mind state, I mean, have you noticed that sometimes you face the same situation, and one day the situation will make you angry, and the day after it's like it's flowing. Mm-hmm. Why? Mm-hmm. Why? It's exactly, more or less exactly the same thing that's happening, but your response is totally different. Why? Because of the mind state. With what attitude are you experiencing what is happening? With what attitude? Your mind is peace. Your mind is filled with greed. Your mind is filled with hatred. Your mind is filled with peace. Your mind is filled with joy. And depending upon how it's going to be filled with, it will condition the way you respond. So that's why it's very interesting to learn to watch that. And on top, what it shows is that thought, again, is an object. Mm-hmm. And the one who is looking is the subject. And these two, when they are not, put together, the way you're going to experience things is radically different. And I'm sure you want to rebound on this.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. That was very, very helpful. I'm going to latch on your concept of focusing on the body, your attention on the body. So leaving the focus on the thoughts or on the mind and returning to the body. I would absolutely agree. I mean, my basic training is also in Buddhism, a little bit different. We're looking at this, perhaps Sophie is more embedded in a Theravadan view, whereas I'm more embedded in a Vajrayana view. And I, through my work as a coach and working directly with people who have no prior knowledge of Buddhism and no interest of moving in that direction, my first approach is always leave the mind, to create distance between yourself and the mind, and do that by entering the body, because our focus can either be on the mind or on the body. And when I say the body, I include the sense perceptions in that. So I can only be paying attention to the mind or be paying attention to the body. There's no other place for me to go. And stability cannot be found in the mind. It can only be found in the body and the sense perceptions. So my first place is to return to the body. As Sophie said, the body is always here. The body is always now. The body is the input channels. And by being in my sense perceptions and in my body, I get new input. I'm reconnecting with what's really happening right now. And I'm not focusing on my interpretation of what's happening right now, but on what is happening right now. And this is very stabilizing. This is very quieting, and it helps to really make one feel more at home in whatever situation one is, even if that situation is tumultuous or very frightening at the moment. The frightening part are the stories that we tell ourselves about the situation. Seldom is it the situation itself, unless we're being chased by a bear. But then in that case or something like that, we're just going to run. And so I think we can all agree that would be okay too. And even in that situation, it's probably best to be in the body and not really in the mind. So we always want to return to the body to create that stability. And then Sophie, you said something else which I think bears repeat. All of it bears repeating, but because of our time limit, I'm going to focus on a few aspects of what you said. And the other one is getting outside of your thoughts. You said, I think it's the third Buddhist approach, the word I forgot that you used. And that is this stepping out and being able to look at the thoughts and realize that you are not your thoughts, breaking in basically the identification with the thoughts. Because if you can see your thoughts, then you must be outside of them. And that creates thoughts as an object and not as the subject. You are not your thoughts. Your thoughts were created sort of in an autopilot mode through the conditioning of your life, from your parents, from your culture, from your society, from school, teachers and friends, from your Buddhist teachers, from your non-Buddhist teachers, and from all of these things that have happened to you and that have had an influence on you. They are what creates your thoughts. And with most of us, this has happened in a very default kind of an autopilot way. And understanding that makes it clear that that isn't always very functional, that hasn't always been very helpful. Some things, they were helpful when they were created, but the situations outside of us change. And then these strategies and these thought patterns are no longer helpful with time. And these are the thought patterns that we need to be able to look at. So we're kind of looking at our thought and not through our thought. So it's looking at your perspective and not looking through your perspective. It's really seeing your thoughts as an object of your perception and not as your perception. And as soon as developing, let's say it's developing this stance is probably the most helpful stance in creating stability and in being stable and being resilient in difficult times, which is precisely what we're asked to do right now, is to be resilient in the face of uncertainty and in frightening things. And here our best option is really to increase our focus on the body and on the sense perceptions, creating more space, as Sophie said, around the thoughts, so that we can see the thoughts as an object outside of ourselves, which is what they really are, because we are the subject looking at the thoughts. And in that subject looking at the thoughts means that the thoughts too are only an object. And if they're an object, then they too must be changeable, and they must be transient, and they must be short term. They don't last forever. They are indeed transitory. So that means that if we can look at our thoughts from outside of them, then we really see their transient nature, and we don't have to hang on to them quite as tightly as that. But I'm going to stop here. I've said a lot again. We're our last 5 minutes. Perhaps, Sophie, you can use these last 5 minutes to give some solid take-home advice to people of how to help themselves in creating stability.
So the first thing really to approach this full discussion, you mentioned and I mentioned the word space, is really about creating space. Mm-hmm. And really to be careful that what we're trying to do here is that we are trying to cultivate, because that's what it is, creating stability is about cultivating, a kind of a soil, cultivating a certain ground that will allow the mind to see more clearly what is experienced. Mm-hmm. And what I'm trying to point out here is that it is not me who decide I'm going to see my thought. Because if I'm there, it means that I'm already thinking of what kind of thought I could see. Mm-hmm. But it's just another thought. Mm-hmm. So here it's really to see we are trying to cultivate. This is really the word. We are trying to cultivate certain conditions, concretely, like bringing back your attention to the breath, bringing back your attention to hearing, bringing back your attention to the sensation in the body, bringing back your attention maybe to tonality, your liking, your disliking, and in doing so, slowly, the mind will stop getting fragmented. It's like the mind slowly will come back home in the here and now, in the body, and in doing so, there is the space, there is the condition that will reveal, that, oh, this is thinking happening. Oh, this is emotion arising. So you create, these conditions create a space where you don't get so much entangled with your thought. They're not so sticky. But of course, there are different kind of thinking, there are different kind of thoughts with different kind of intensity. If you have a habit for 40 years in a similar situation to always react mentally in the same way, of course, the thought here will have a lot of power, and it will take quite a while to be able simply to meet it, to recognize what it is, to recognize what it does to you. First, you may be just taken into the story. So that's why it's really a lot about cultivating this space with all the different tools that has been offered and that are offered, so that this space can be really created, and the opportunity to see the thinking mind happening and how you tend to be caught up in it. It's really about discovering things. Again, it's not about eradicating thinking. It's not about having no thoughts. It's about entering in a friendly and healthy relationship with this part of your mind that allows you also to function in your life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a radical different view here. Is it?
It is. It is.
Okay.
It is. I can speak from my experience, and yes, it has been life-changing. No doubt. Yes, thank you. So we're pretty much at the end of our time. Thank you. I think the word space and the word creating space and cultivating space and cultivating a new relationship, a new view of the mind, of your thoughts. And I think this is what we can take with us today, and increasing our time spent in the body, decreasing our time spent listening to the mind, lost in the mind, and creating that space around the mind. And thus, with time, as Sophie said, it does not go from one day to the next, but maybe some people, I've needed a while. We begin to become wider and wider and more stable and more resilient, and life just becomes pretty darn okay. My favorite word. So, Sophie, thank you so much. Thank you. Creating stability with Lisa and Sophie.